to reduce it. So I'd like to start with thanking Tom and Steve for the invitation, and actually they helped a little bit in terms of focusing the paper. We started off with maybe a larger sort of set of criteria and came down to what was actually really available. I also want to acknowledge my co-authors, Ruth and Sina. Ruth works with me at ITS, and Sina is actually a student at University of Delft and also works for a company called UTAUT, so I don't know how to pronounce it, in Berlin, that are looking at this kind of thing. So our work with Ruth is based partly on the City Mobile 2 project, which was funded by the European Commission and finished in August. The deliverables are being looked at as we speak by the Commission, so hopefully in the next 6 months or so, some of those will be available publicly. You're probably familiar, if you've seen it on the internet or actually experienced it, some of you yourself, the City Mobile 2. This is one of the vehicles that was created by Robosoft, and there's another one, Easy 10. Sina is working with the OLI in Berlin and also as part of the WePods in the Netherlands, and she's looking at the public acceptance as a term, looking at the social psychological factors. So it was very nice to have her actually on board, looking at some of the City Mobile 2 data, which we're writing a paper about. And when I was asked by Tom and Steve to write this paper, I thought she would be a nice co-author because she's very deeply into that. So the focus of my paper, our paper, is very much around the shared public automated vehicle, SAE level 4. So really not looking at the privately owned vehicles that have been discussed by some of the speakers this morning, and very much looking at that City Mobile 2 type vehicle and on the shared side of things. So looking at the social psychological factors, trust, acceptance, which kind of people like it, will use it, and so on. And I went with some subheadings that Tom and Steve asked me to look at in particular, looking at the user's willingness and trust of this technology and how we can achieve trust, not too much trust, maybe just adequate trust. Users' willingness to share these vehicles with each other, with others, with strangers, and so on. The interaction of these vehicles with pedestrians and cyclists, and realistic opportunities for serving mobility impaired people, older people, young people, and so on. And this is definitely one of the areas that AVs are being promoted for. So in order to prepare the paper, I thought maybe it's a good idea to actually look at this sort of what promotes conventional carpooling and car sharing, what makes people accept it and use it compared to using their own vehicle. We looked at some large-scale surveys of AVs and people's understanding on the sort of social psychological side, and these are mostly online and have used tens of thousands of people to get their ideas of what they want from these things. And actually, this is more around the private AV rather than the shared AV, so we were a little bit limited there. Very few real-world studies. They're sort of popping up slowly, but there's still not much data on the social, psychological, the user acceptance side of things. It's still very much around making these things work, go from A to B. How do you get through the park where actually there's quite a lot of trees stopping the thing moving and so on. So very much around the technology. Still very, very limited in terms of what people think about it. And finally, there's been actually quite a lot of work on interaction and acceptance, etc., of people with robots or other sorts of automation. There's a lot in the armies, for example. Some of that work is now being used in terms of models, etc., for AV. So we touch on a little bit on it in the paper, though. So looking at the conventional car sharing side of things, well, the motivation actually is very, very similar to what AVs are supposed to be about. So the idea, when these were developed in the certainly in the States especially, 1960s, maybe even earlier, and the idea behind these is try to reduce traffic volume, reduce fuel use and associated emissions, reduce the need for parking, and reduce the cost of travel. And it will be therefore better for you to use these compared to your private vehicle. And then the idea is really to try and promote better use of getting from A to B where maybe public transport wasn't available, reduce your fatigue as a driver, and so you'd be fresher when you get to work, and you can work longer hours and so on. And believe it or not, even improve your social interaction with others, provide friendship with where you might not have it. So that's for conventional car sharing. But in terms of who uses it and whether or not people use it, it's very mixed. So the literature seems to suggest that some say women prefer it, some say men prefer it, some say older people like it, some say younger people like it, and this is for conventional carpooling. But it seems to be more and more popular, and certainly now because of the various apps that are available, people are starting to use these conventional forms of carpooling, certainly within cities, etc., because they want to use their time for other things, and that seems to be one of the main reasons. But the reasons they don't use it are particularly around enjoying your privacy. So they still very much focus on, I want my car for myself, and I don't really want to share my time and my space with other people. And most importantly, perhaps, the time it takes to arrange and the cost of these things are still at least perceived to be higher than for using your own vehicle. And one of the authors of the paper regarding time and cost in particular suggests that perhaps governments need to look into promoting the benefits of these systems more and more, and that actually maybe it doesn't take as much time as you think, and maybe it doesn't cost as much as you think. And certainly when we're coming to AVs, that seems to be one of the things that we could look at, is that actually for getting rid of your private car, you maybe want to think about the fact that actually it's not as cost effective as you think as sharing. And certainly there's some research that shows that one of the reasons we use our private car is just basically purely based on habit, and we're just used to using that. And there's a bit more in my paper about that. So the other aspect, respect to users' use of thoughts of AVs, is web-based studies. And there's quite a few of those popping around sort of from both North America and Europe, where thousands and thousands of people have been asked, what do they think of these things? Do they like it? Will they use it? Will they pay for it? And so on. And at least in terms of the way the news and the media portray it, and this is not perhaps surprising, it's like, no, we hate it, we don't want to use it, I'd rather be in control, etc., etc. My argument is that maybe one of the reasons for that is people just have no idea what you're talking about. It's not necessarily the case that they are as amazing as they are portrayed, but it's very difficult to phone someone up and say, well, you know, have you seen the Google car or whatever it might be? What do you think? Are you going to buy that? What do they have to base that on? Pretty much just the YouTube video or whatever. So whilst these are useful to give some idea of what the consumer might think, the only way we're going to really be able to understand the social psychological aspects of whether or not people want to use these things, will use these things, is for them to have hands-on experience. And this is why I don't like the term user acceptance, because it suggests that I have created this thing for you, are you going to accept it or not? And actually what it should be much more about is working with the user to develop these things and ensure that they accept what's the acceptance is very much around what they want from them rather than what it provides. And this is going to be very much the focus of my talk around making sure that it's developed for the user in mind. So, what do we mean by acceptance, acceptability, trust, etc.? So they're used interchangeably, and there is disagreement perhaps in the literature what they mean. But put it very simply, acceptability is prospective and acceptance is post hoc. So you might quite like the idea of this thing, this level 4 vehicle that is available to you, but it's only when you use it and use it effectively is I know that you've accepted it. Okay, and we've there is now sort of popping up in the literature models where that have been developed for a long time, but actually being applied to automated vehicles to understand whether or not people will accept these systems. So the technology acceptance model, and then it's then developed into the UTAUT, or the Unified Theory of Acceptance and Use of Technology, has been used for all sorts of technology, for ATMs and so on. And it's starting to be used on vehicle automation. A couple of studies on the use of ACC. But as far as I can tell, the work that we did in City Mobile 2 is the first time where it's being used to look at people's acceptance rather of AVs. So just for those who might not be familiar, I'll just go through quickly. The questions are basically categorized by a few constructs, whether it performs well as expected, so performance expectancy, effort expectancy, so how much effort is required to use the technology. Hedonic motivation, that is actually a new concept, and that's very much around how much fun it is to use it. Facilitating conditions, so what around the infrastructure allows the vehicle to do what it's supposed to do. Social influence, will you use it if your friends use it, if your mum uses it, compared to if they don't. Price value, obviously, value for money, and habit, I've mentioned before, the extent to which we are used to using a technology or not. And asking users in City Mobile 2 vehicles whether or not, sort of a series of questions and whether it influences their behavior of using it, we found that performance expectancy, hedonic motivation, and facilitating conditions were the ones that pretty much came out as the strongest predictors of whether or not people will use these systems. So, not surprisingly, if it works well, yes, I will use it again. If what is around the sort of in terms of the infrastructure allows it to work well and lets me get from A to B, yes, I'm more likely to use it than not. And hedonic motivation, so at the moment, it's fun, it's something new. I've never used something like this before, I will use it. The question, of course, is that as we get more and more used to these things, is this going to be still predictive of our use? And I guess for manufacturers, it's important to make sure that they carry on being fun and that they actually help us do what we want to do. For example, that they have good Wi-Fi systems, that we can work in them. So it's not just from getting A to B, but actually we can do something in there productive while they're getting us from A to B. Otherwise, we'll end up using our own car or using the train, which is probably a bit better for that kind of thing. So that's very much around sort of whether or not we're going to accept these systems, but it's not the same as whether we're going to trust the systems. And Brian unintentionally took me nicely to discussing trust in my talk. We didn't talk about it. So that's the $1 million question. How can we influence people's trust? There's a lot of work done on trust in social psychological literature to do with everything to do with technology. It's very, very complex. complicated, and I will not, I'm sorry, have an answer for you. So, you know, the literature is about that thick, and I can't possibly put it into a talk. This gives you some idea of how complicated it might be. This is work done by a lady at, I can't remember, she works for the army, but I can't remember where she's placed now, but I know that she worked with Peter Hancock for quite a while. She did her PhD, and this just gives you some idea of how complicated it will be to look at the interaction of the human and the robot, and whether or not we will trust the robot. So the robot's features, the human's traits, and the environment they're in all interact with each other and have influence on each other on whether or not we will trust a particular system. And age, gender, etc., all have an effect. Now, slightly better is maybe just a few examples of, actually there are things that people have shown that mostly we agree have an effect on trust. And because it's about human factors, I think you will all say, yeah, I can see that will make me trust something, or it will not make me trust something. Unfortunately, also with human factors, is that for every study that shows one aspect, there's another study which says no, that's not the case. So, but generally speaking, these are some of the things that we do tend to agree on. So, perhaps not surprisingly, whether it's or not a system is usable will increase our trust. But if it does something we didn't expect it to do, it completely ruins our trust. Okay? So another aspect is making sure that the system is developed for the target user group. So there is no point in putting something together that is not going to be usable by its user. And that's really important when it comes to where we are today, talking about AV, because I can say pretty much 99% of the work that's been done on this system has not included the people who want to use and would like to use and could benefit from using it, i.e. the very young and the very old. So most of the work has been done by the average male driver, dare I say. So that's something that we really need to look into. If we want to understand whether or not these things are going to be used, we have to target the actual user group. Another aspect of trust and whether or not it will increase is the feedback we get from it. Now, this is one of the areas that there is a bit of disagreement. Some say that it's a good idea to get for the user to know what's going on with the system, and they're getting feedback, they know what's happening, etc. I think that's maybe true about vehicles that are still being partly driven, so maybe level 2, 3 vehicles and the driver. But when you go to level 4 vehicles, do I really want to know whether or not the system is going to be breaking or not? I just want it to work, and that's what so I don't think I want feedback there. And there's an example in the paper of where feedback might not be useful. I cannot pronounce this word. I don't know why. It just makes me go, anthropomorphism. So how similar it is to a human. And again, there's a bit of disagreement as to whether or not it's a good idea, but how it communicates with you, whether it looks like, sounds like your wife or your mum or whatever, seems to increase people's trust in it. But there's not always agreement there. And actually some studies have shown that if it sounds more machine-like, it's more trusting because the machine knows better than your mum. Okay, so this paper by John Lee and his student in 2004 really needs updating, and every time I see John Lee, he says it's happening. So look out for the 2017 version of it, because when they wrote this, AVs as they are now weren't really available. Some of it is however, relevant. So designing for appropriate trust, so not too much trust, not too little trust, is important. Looking at the Past performance of the automation may increase trust. I'm not going to go through this because I don't know how much time I've got, but the general idea is that people need to understand the machine and its system in order to trust it. Again, I am not sure whether this now applies to higher level AVs, where you might just want to get in. You don't need to understand whether the train works or not. You just want to get in and let it do what it needs to do. So I've put it really simply in terms of the trust is that I have a goal and I have an idea of what I want the automation to do for me, and I want that to be reliable, and the animation isn't working here, unfortunately. I didn't test this one, but I will trust it if it's reliable, and if it's reliable, I will trust it, and it will go round and round, okay? Now, when it comes to driving, when I'm in control of the vehicle and sometimes the vehicle is automated, that can be a problem, because if I trust it too much, then I get into complacency, and if it breaks, I wasn't expecting it, and so the trust goes away. Again, that might not necessarily be true for level 4 AV. Okay, just a few other points that are the sort of aspects of shared AVs, which Steve and Tom asked me to look into. So, will we trust, will we like sharing these things when they're unattended with strangers? So a typical example here of the Ultra vehicle, which is being developed in London, and there's many similar. The main issue is there has to be look into how they will affect our privacy. We like our cars because they're private, and there are aspects that can be improved to improve our privacy. It's never going to be, unless we basically just share it with our friends and family, it's not going to be completely private. But if you look at a bus or a train or an aeroplane, there have been some ideas there in terms of making it feel like it's your own space. These things at the moment do not make you feel like that at all. In fact, if they have a seat, you're lucky. Okay, so that's one of the things. So you have the next generation really needs to look into how I can have my space in this unattended vehicle if they want me to use it. Mixed views about whether the sort of operator will increase my likelihood of changing sharing, and yes, I think it's sort of if there's someone there, if you know that there is connection maybe remotely where it's with an operator, that you feel a little bit more likely to use it than not. Studies showing that, these are online, mind you, that if I can share it with my friends or even friends of friends on Facebook, this is a new one, then I'm more likely to use it than complete strangers. And most importantly, making sure that it feels safe to be in there at night time and so on. I was asked to look into whether or not they really at the moment serve opportunity to serve mobility impaired people. I don't know, because we haven't really seen anything in terms of real world studies that show that. I know there is one study in the UK in Birmingham that's looking at visually impaired people and their use of these systems. So we need to basically have the studies to look at it before we can say yes they are or not. But to be honest, it feels very much like it needs to be at the higher level, the SAE 5 level, really, for them to be productive. What's the point of how do I get to it as a mobility impaired person before I can use it? So even if it's at its best, I still need to be able to get to it. And if I can't get to it, then it can be wheelchair friendly, but that's one of the issues. And I must say, actually, I love the fact this is the first time for the last 5 years or so that I've been to a meeting where the 22nd century was mentioned, the possibility of having SAE 5. So it makes me feel like I'm in the right room. So that was good to see. So final couple of slides on interaction with other road users. This is very much a new area, as far as I can tell. I think manufacturers are looking at this privately. I can say for sure that some really have not thought about it until very recently. So I have asked questions about how do you deal with other road users, and the answer has been it stops. No, that's not the same as dealing with other road users. If it stops in front of me, that's good. It won't hit me, but it's not going to move out of the way if I don't move out of the way. That is not called interacting with other users. So if we are to be in a shared environment, we need to be in a situation where the vehicle can interact with me and I can interact with it to tell each other our intentions, just like we do when vehicles have got drivers. We are quite a long way from that, I think. So, a few studies that have looked at it. Missy Cummings at Duke, has, this is an interesting paper looking at whether or not people use the messages that you can see there. They just basically had it in front of a driverless van, and actually people don't. They very much use the speed of the vehicle as it's coming to decide whether or not they're going to cross. And that's very similar to some patents out by Google as to this is how we will communicate with people. I love this study that's done in Sweden, of course, where they've looked at a dummy driver. Those of you who went to AVS probably have seen it, where they basically put a steering wheel on the side of the passenger, and they hide the real steering wheel, and then they look at what people think about if the sort of driver, in inverted commas, is asleep or reading a newspaper, etc. And of course people hate it, and it sort of followed on to develop some lighting and so on as part of a Volvo study to allow passengers to pedestrians to understand whether it's stopping, whether it's in automation, etc. Nice idea, but this is where standards come in, Peter. You have no idea what this light means, if it's going that way, or if it's light going that way, if it's red, if it's... Apparently blue is the colour for automation, by the way, just in case you didn't know. Who knows that? So we've got a lot of work to do on that area. Finally, my own work in City Mobile 2, where we asked 664 people, pedestrians and cyclists around the cities of La Rochelle and Tricolo in Greece and Lausanne in Switzerland, a series of questions trying to understand what they wanted from these vehicles. So we gave them, we showed them these photos. This is in La Rochelle, by the way, where we drew this red mark, which didn't exist in the trial, and we asked them things like, do you feel safe crossing over when there isn't that sort of path compared to where there is? Who has priority? And they didn't feel as safe if the vehicle was automated compared to if it was manually driven. But interestingly, when there was no line, they thought as pedestrians and cyclists they had priority, and when there was a line, they thought the vehicle had priority. And this is very interesting, considering that most of the work that's being done at the moment for these vehicles is actually with no demarcation on the road. So for now, because there's no information from these vehicles, pedestrians are likely to be in a conflict situation with these vehicles because nobody knows what's happening. Other interesting points were people in focus groups saying that I don't know which way it's going because there's no driver and it looks exactly the same. There's no front and back, so don't really know what's going on. In terms of information, the most important thing they want to know is, has it detected me? You know, you can imagine that sort of when there's a driver in there, you can sort of, the driver goes like that if you're trying to cross it. No information, at least at the moment, exists for that. So lots and lots of work to be done, and hopefully I'll get to do some of it before some of the car companies do some of it. But still work to be done. So some other work, results from real world studies, and they are very few and far between. This is some more work from City Mobile 2, where colleagues in Southampton asked users, both using telephone surveys and one-to-one interviews in the La Rochelle area, whether they thought AVs were more acceptable than the conventional buses. Now, there's some interesting interpretations, shall we say, to be made of that, because the questions basically said, well, these are going to be lower prices because there's no driver. There's going to be more spaces than because there's no controls. Do you think you prefer these to buses? Funnily enough, they said yes, but it's still not absolutely certain whether they are going to be cheaper than buses because there's no driver. So I think there's some research to be done, but certainly it seemed to be that yes, they preferred them not compared to normal buses, but they were concerned about security, especially at night. The CATS project, which was done in 2014, that used the I've forgotten the name of the manufacturer, it will come to me in a minute, in Lausanne, and actually was preceded by the City Mobile 2 work. And the users there were very, very positive about these vehicles that went around the same sort of area as the City Mobile 2. So they thought it was user-friendly, aesthetic, etc. But one of the issues was that they didn't like the fact that it didn't have any seating, and there seemed to be a problem with them going up and down slopes, so it didn't feel very comfortable. Michelle's smiling, he's probably quite aware of that. So, and Navia, that's the word. So this is the Navia vehicle then in 2014, and they obviously took it on board, and this is the Navia vehicle now. So it's, you can see in a couple of years, it's really developed into what looks like a bus, funnily enough. This sort of going that way. So I don't know how long I went. Yep, I should stop now. Thankfully, it's my last slide. Want to sort of, actually one more after this, sorry Steve. Want to really emphasize the fact that we have to use the user when it comes to developing. So there's now a lot of opportunity for us as users of these systems to engage on what we want and what we don't want. So governance is important, companies are important, but there's a third one now, which is us, and what we use, what we don't use, and how social networks and apps, etc., are making the decision on what we use and what we don't use are really, really important. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go more into that. And I had this at the last page of my paper, and it definitely has probably some room for improvement. But my idea is that really we have a division of the private semi-automated vehicle level 2, level 3, which we will use, or the fully automated level 4, 5 shared vehicle. And at the moment you can see that some have been developed in one and the other, some need development and some are completely not possible. And I guess until all of the shared automated are black, then we are in that situation where we're not going to be using these systems. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I don't have the time to go into it. So thank you for your attention. Lunchtime. Thank you.